Hello, everybody. This is the Mindenségit podcast, and we are sitting here in the World Adaptation Forum Conference 2025. And I have the pleasure to announce to you guys, Ginie Servant-Miklos is here with us today. Hi, Ginie.
Happy to be here with you.
Ginie is an assistant professor at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. She's also engaged environmental educator with 15 years of experience in education practice, research, and advocacy. She currently holds an assistant professorship in behavioral sciences at the Erasmus School of Social and Behavioural. Her research and education work focuses on developing innovative pedagogies for societal impact. She developed the Experimental Pedagogics educational design framework, co-founded the Bildung Climate School with Professor Rutger Engels, and is the author of Pedagogies of Collapse, a hopeful education for the end of the world as we know it.
That's right. And I'm guessing that's my biography from the Club of Rome. So I should also add that last year I joined the Club of Rome as associate member.
Cool. I would also add that if I were you. Yeah, nice. Thank you. My question would be to start with, if you could select one thing, what would it be, you think, the biggest challenge of our civilization at this moment of time?
I guess because I'm the only psychologist at the Deep Adaptation Forum, I'm going to go with a psychological answer. As a psychologist, the biggest challenge I see is facing our predicament truthfully without falling into denial, despair, and psychological mechanisms that will only lead us further down the road to destruction.
But that's a pretty high bar. I mean, as far as I can understand the world and the things that happen, this is the thing we do. I mean, we just don't want to see reality as it is. We don't believe our eyes. We rather believe things people want to tell us.
It's true that we have tendencies towards this, but part of the work I do is to accompany people into especially collective rituals of grief, collective mechanisms of dealing with this that are more resilient. Mm-hmm. Part of the reason that we fall into denial and depression is because our society, the society we currently live in, and this is especially true in the global north, simply doesn't have the coping mechanisms. A society that is heavily based on material success, individualism, and the idea that if you don't succeed in that system, it is a personal failure, cannot be resilient in the face of systemic collapse. But that said, I have also learned, because I do a lot of work in the global south, I have also seen collapse firsthand in the global south. And I would hate to romanticize their resilience towards collapse, because they are definitely more collapse resilient than we are. But I have seen very frightening coping mechanisms, for instance, in Zambia and Zimbabwe, where I do a lot of work, such as, particularly among young men, the excessive use of dangerous drugs like crystal meth.
Okay. What do you think makes humans prone to denial? And why do we have a proclivity to be misled at all?
So from a grief theory standpoint, denial is the first stage of grief. I think part of the reason that our grief process gets stuck in that stage rather than moving through the whole process and allowing us to go towards the last stage, which is acceptance, which I understand as a moment where we are able to reconstruct something new. I think part of the reason we get stuck in the first phase of the grieving process is because we do not have even the words to acknowledge that it is grief that we're experiencing. I remember when I started doing this work in 2018, and I started talking about climate grief in the data that I was seeing from my qualitative studies on how young people experience what we're going through, and I started to use the word grief, I was rejected everywhere. In scientific papers, in my own department. And it's only when this famous study by Ashley Kunslow was published in Nature, where she outlined the topic of climate grief, that it started to be more commonly understood. But of course, climate grief was a topic that was very much discussed in indigenous circles, in feminist philosophy, but in a world dominated by a kind of patriarchal view of science, talking about emotions like grief was taboo.
I'm not entirely sure if everyone would know, who listens to this talk, what climate grief is. Could you define it for us?
Yeah, so there's different definitions of climate grief, because there's grieving for the people who have already experienced the effects of climate change. For instance, indigenous communities whose forests have already burned down. The people in Los Angeles right now who lost their homes to the Palisades fire, for instance. People in Belgium and Germany whose houses were taken away by floods. Those people experience grief as a result of climate catastrophe. But there is also a different, more insidious form of grief, which is grief by anticipation. Okay. We are grieving in advance a loss that we know is coming, but that doesn't yet have a definite shape. And that is very insidious because, one, you don't really know what it is that you're about to lose. You just know that it's going to be big and that it's going to be painful. And two, there is no end to the loss. So when someone dies, that's a definitive, they're not going to die anymore. They only die once. But with climate grief, it's not like the CO2 that's in the atmosphere is going to disappear after 10 years. It's in there for 10,000 years. So the catastrophes are going to keep intensifying way beyond our own lifetime. And so we know that's a process that we're going to have to keep going through over and over. And that is really terrifying. In some ways, the anticipation of loss is even harder to process than the loss that's already happened.
The subtitle of this year's conference is Beyond Mitigation. And I wonder if everything's beyond mitigation, what do we actually get if we can fulfill our grieving process? What is the result that we'll be getting in ourselves?
A meaningful life. That's the thing that I fight for. That's the thing that keeps me going. That's how I manage to get out of bed in the morning, is to acknowledge my finitude. I was never going to live forever anyways. It's a very existential thing to do, but I think we are in a very existential moment. We need to reckon with the fact that humans are mortal, despite the promises of tech billionaires. We're not going to upload our consciousnesses into silicon chips and fly off to Mars. That's not going to happen. You and I are going to die. And that is something that human cultures have reckoned with throughout all of human history. But we somehow believe that we were immune to that. And so reconciling with death means understanding that meaning is something you do in the present, no matter what happens after. So my task is to help young people build meaningful lives, find meaning and joy in being with each other, in working towards something, even if that something ultimately fails because of the circumstances of collapse. Just the act of doing it is worth it. And that for me is the most beautiful form of resolution of grief. I recently had to close down a project for circumstances that were outside of my control in India, and it was a huge loss. I felt grief very intensely, but ultimately the litmus test was, did we make life better for each other in the 10 years that we worked together? And I think the answer is yes. And so even though ultimately we had to close things down, and I will probably never see the people that I worked with for 10 years, including all the girls that I worked with again, it was still worth doing. It was still meaningful. And heartbreak is part of the human condition. It's one of the most beautiful things, actually, because if you are grieving something, it means that you loved something. And I do not envy a life in which there was no love. Mm-hmm. So it's worth the price to pay.
Yeah, I agree. Do you think when people think about collapse, which is, I think, arguably inevitable, shouldn't they maybe also think about it as a chance to create something new? Like, not only as death, but also as birth?
That is definitely a possibility. I hope actually that civilization collapses before we destroy the biospheric conditions so entirely that no rebirth can happen. But then that is a frighteningly possible scenario. But we have to understand, I think when we think, yes, there's going to be a lot of hardship, a lot of death, and then we can restart, you and I might not be among the ones who survive. And that is a very real possibility. So we have to learn to live with that. Mm-hmm. So that also means getting out of this hyper me focused mentality where we think, what seeds can I leave so that sometime down in the future, other humans that are not me can take this up and things can flourish again. It demands of us a decentering of ourselves, which is the complete opposite of the kind of turbo-capitalized neoliberal Instagram generation kind of mentality. And it's a very hard thing to do when all we've been told for 20, 30 years is just follow your own dreams, do your own thing, be you, and me, and consume more. To step away from that and say, I'm doing something for something bigger than myself. And I do think people are wired to look towards greater things, what Ernest Becker called hero projects. I think that people are wired towards that. And we see, I think, a toxic expression of that in like hyper-nationalism, kind of proto-fascist ideology. So we have to find a way to channel those natural instincts of humans to do something meaningful beyond themselves towards a greater humanist project.
Wow. You know what just came to my mind is this feeling that some people get when they have a real sacred psychedelic experience, when you get the feeling that there is really not a discussion about consciousness, whether the other person is friend or foe. It's just irrelevant. It's like, then it's also very similar to when you're in a real flow channel, when you're doing something just for the sake of doing, like playing music with others or reading a really good book or whatever, art or sport, whatever that could be. And then you're in a state in which you're not really you anymore, you're just a tool that's doing the thing.
It's funny that you mention that because my current research project at Erasmus University is on eco-anxiety and psychedelics. My next book focuses heavily on the topic of psychedelics, and I particularly work on the potential of psilocybin to help people process their fear of death and their fear of collapse. I live in the Netherlands, so we can do that. But the other side, the other tool that I work with is Bildung. It's a German-Danish philosophy of personal emancipation, let's say personal development through art, music, dance, in my case also karate, but like embodied practices, artistic practices that kind of nourish the soul and the meaning of what it means to be human. And I integrate the Bildung side of things into the education programs that I develop in the Netherlands. It's a very holistic approach that I take to basically restore meaning to human lives. I wouldn't say as tools. What psychedelics has taught me, and I'm like an avowed and public speaker on psychedelics, so I use them quite a lot. What it's taught me is not to be a tool, but just to be. Just to exist sometimes without further necessity to, like, when the ego dissolves, you're left with just consciousness as just being.
Yeah.
And that recreates the capacity to connect to other people. Sometimes you have to be careful. So I'm very nuanced and careful about psychedelics because Elon Musk also takes psychedelics, ketamine notably, which is a synthetic psychedelic. And that Aldous Huxley, in his famous book, The Doors of Perception, described his experience on mescaline when he described a detachment from humanity where he didn't care about other people anymore. And that can also be a side effect. So whatever tools we use, whether it is chemical compounds like psychedelics, whether it is pedagogical practices like Bildung, it's all about what purpose are you using it for. And the purpose has to always be there in your mind. The purpose for me is recreating meaning together. I'm not really interested at this stage, while I'm still alive in this human body, in merging with the universe. I'll do that when I'm dead.
Okay. What are your hopes regarding to this year's conference? What do you think it can add to existence?
Can I be a little cheeky?
Sure.
And say, this is a joke that also some friends shared with me when I shared the program. They're like, wow, that's a lot of white men and not a lot of women represented there. I do think, and this is one of the things that drove me into this field, that we need more diverse voices in the field of collapsology. And I really hope to be able to show that women, people from the social sciences, people from the humanities are essential contributors to this field by providing a perspective that, as laudable as all the science that most of these engineer-focused men bring to the table, and I completely subscribe to their conclusions, but just throwing that out there, it's not enough. What I really hope is that I can bring a way to talk to people in a way that really touches people's existential longings. Not fears, but longings. I think if the collapsology movement can learn from this conference to speak more to people's existential longings, it will have a much broader reach. It will raise a lot less fears in the broader public than it currently does.
Great. And I think it also fills a huge gap. And we need less of materialism in this case, I think. Ginie, thanks for talking to us today.
Thank you for this lively conversation.
Cool, thanks.